My name is Eleanor Miles. I built an empire, raised a daughter on my own, and survived betrayal in more forms than I can count. But nothing prepared me for the day I overheard my only child tell her lawyer, "She's old, irrelevant. Let's erase her cleanly." They thought I'd crumble. They thought time had worn down the sharpness of my mind, that I'd be too soft, too slow to see what was coming. They were wrong. Behind every sacrifice I made was a strategy. Behind every quiet retreat was a move they didn't understand. And when they tried to erase me from the very legacy I bled to build, I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I documented. I planned. And I waited. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about truth. How silence, wielded with precision, can be louder than any war cry. So sit down, because this time the storm comes quietly. They say motherhood is a gift, a calling. For me, it was a promise whispered through clenched teeth during cold nights in a one-bedroom apartment with a leaking ceiling and a colicky newborn. I was 22 when I held Catherine for the first time. Her fingers no bigger than matchsticks, her cries slicing through my exhaustion like a siren. I didn't have a husband, just a name on a birth certificate and a silence that stretched for years. I told myself it didn't matter. She had me. That would be enough. For the next 4 decades, I made it true. I clawed my way through the tech industry in the early 90s, breaking into networks by day and studying criminal code by night. Eventually, the government noticed. They offered me a badge, then a title. Then came the private sector. More money, more power, longer hours. But I always made it home for bedtime stories, science fairs, scraped knees. I gave her everything. My time, my peace, my ambition. When Catherine turned 17, she brought home a boy named Joshua, bright, charismatic, too polished for a teenager from our neighborhood. I didn't like the way he watched her when she wasn't looking, but Catherine's smile bloomed when he was around, and I had promised myself never to be the kind of mother who clipped her daughter's wings. By the time she graduated college, they were inseparable. I paid for the wedding, bought them a starter home, hired Joshua into the legal team of the company I had built from scratch. "He's brilliant," Catherine insisted. "He reminds me of you." Maybe that should have been my first warning. Years passed. I stepped back. Let her lead the company. It was supposed to be her legacy now. I moved into the guest house behind her estate, not because I had to, but because she said, "Mom, I want you close. You deserve comfort." So I traded a penthouse for a garden view and late-night cocoa with my granddaughter. The house echoed with marble floors, laughter from rooms I rarely entered, and quiet decisions I was no longer invited to witness. Until the night, I overheard them talking. Through the thin air vent above the guest house kitchen, Catherine's voice cold and flat. "She's no longer an asset, just a liability. It's time." I stood frozen, mug of cocoa trembling in my hand. My own daughter, my flesh, my future, plotting to erase me like an outdated document. I didn't cry. I remembered. Every diaper, every deadline, every moment I swallowed my pride so she could rise. I wasn't obsolete. I was just underestimated. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the quiet dark of the guest house, wrapped in the same wool shawl I wore when Catherine was born, staring out at the manicured lawn I had paid to have installed. Lights from the main house glowed like distant stars, beautiful, untouchable. I tried to tell myself there had been a mistake. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe she didn't mean it that way, but I hadn't misunderstood. Catherine's voice was etched in my bones. I knew the cadence of her anger, her calculation. She wasn't venting. She was making a decision. By sunrise, I had packed a small suitcase. Not because I planned to leave, not yet, but because instinct told me the winds had shifted. Something old, military, and primal stirred in my gut. I had survived war rooms filled with men who thought I was too soft to lead. I had crushed cybersecurity breaches that threatened entire financial systems. But this was different. This was betrayal cloaked in affection. This was an enemy who knew me intimately. I went about my day as if nothing had happened, made breakfast for Lily, my granddaughter, who hugged me tightly around the waist and said, "You're the warmest part of this house, Grandma." I kissed her forehead and nearly broke right there. Joshua passed me in the hallway later and nodded, his smile just a little too sharp, his eyes a little too empty. I watched him disappear into his study and imagined the files he was preparing. Legal arguments, guardianship declarations, quiet power plays designed to paint me as incapable. I wasn't afraid of losing assets. I had never cared for titles or real estate. What chilled me was the thought of being rewritten, of Catherine presenting a version of our history where I was merely a burden she had tolerated, where everything I built became hers by default, not because I gave it willingly, but because I was conveniently erased. That evening at dinner, Catherine spoke about business expansions. She tossed numbers and names around like confetti, all while pretending not to notice I hadn't said a word. Joshua added commentary, smug and strategic. No one looked me in the eye. Until Lily asked, "Grandma, how come there are no pictures of you in the house?" The table went still. Catherine cleared her throat, chuckled too lightly. "They're in storage, sweetie. Grandma prefers her privacy." Lily looked at me, unconvinced, and in that moment, I knew. My story was already being buried, quietly, efficiently, and with terrifying politeness. But I wasn't ready to be forgotten. I had given everything. Now I would take it back. One secret, one record, one truth at a time. After dinner, I returned to the guest house and locked the door behind me. My hands moved by memory, not thought. I pulled open the hidden panel behind the bedroom armoire, a remnant from my days in federal cybersecurity. Inside was a fireproof case no one else knew existed. I laid it on the bed and clicked it open. Inside were flash drives, printed bank statements, voice memos, and an old burner phone. Not because I'd ever planned for war with my daughter, but because old agents never forget how to document. And deep down, I must have known something like this might one day come. The first folder I opened was labeled Funding. It contained records from 5 years ago when I transferred majority ownership of Miles' cyber defense to Catherine. At the time, it felt like a gift of trust, a gesture of belief in her leadership. But the documents told a different story now. Small amendments, silent modifications. Joshua's fingerprints were everywhere. Subtle changes to the bylaws that slowly edged me out of decision-making power. The second file made my throat tighten. It was a voice memo from 6 months ago. I had recorded it after a board meeting where Catherine dismissed one of my concerns in front of a dozen stakeholders, then laughed it off like I was a confused aunt who wandered into the wrong room. At the time, I had brushed it off. Now I listen to my own voice, weary but trying to stay composed. She doesn't see me anymore. Or maybe she does, and that's the problem. I spent hours combing through records, tracing the slow erosion of my influence. The emails Catherine never forwarded, the clients she cut ties with because they were too loyal to me, and worst of all, the internal memos she had sent to Joshua, one of which read, "We need to move her out of public-facing roles before Q4. The optics aren't on our side." The optics? That's what I had become. A liability, a narrative risk. By 2 a.m., my guest house was covered in papers and digital files. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by the evidence of my own erasure. But I wasn't defeated. I was armed. I picked up the burner phone and called an old contact, someone who owed me more than one favor. "Still have access to court databases?" I asked. A long pause. Then, "For you?" "Always. What are we digging up?" I looked out the window toward the main house. Its lights were out, its occupants asleep in comfort they hadn't earned. "My daughter," I said calmly, "and everyone helping her." The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Sleep had been scarce, but purpose was potent fuel. I brewed a strong cup of coffee and sat at the small table by the window, reviewing the notes I'd compiled in the night. My mind moved with the same disciplined precision I used back when I managed federal counter-cyber operations. Only this time, the enemy wasn't a hacker in Moscow or a rogue contractor in Singapore. It was my own blood. I started small. I called the bank, not the main line, but my personal account manager, the one I had helped secure a promotion years ago after a cyber breach. I asked for an audit on all recent activity connected to the Miles Family Trust. She hesitated, likely warned by some internal flag. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Miles. I believe those authorizations are now handled by—" "I created the trust," I interrupted, my voice firm. "I still hold oversight on financial review. Please send me a report of all transactions from the last 12 months. A beat. Then, "Yes, of course. I'll send that directly to your secure email within the hour." When the report arrived, I nearly choked on my coffee. Hundreds of thousands had been quietly moved, some to shell corporations, some to legal retainer firms in Joshua's name. The amounts weren't suspicious by themselves, but the patterns were. Laundering, diversion, obfuscation. I had taught these tricks to federal agents in training, and now they were being used on me. I forwarded the data to my contact, attaching a single line, "Map the destination accounts. Priority level, red." Next, I turned to the staff, quietly. There's always someone who sees more than they should. A gardener, a housekeeper, someone who knows where the bodies are metaphorically buried. I reached out to Elena, the former nanny who had been with Catherine during her teen years. We hadn't spoken in a while, but she answered on the second ring. "Eleanor," she said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" "I need to know something," I said. Did Catherine ever mention revising the trust or trying to prove I wasn't fit to manage my affairs? A pause, then softly, "She asked me to testify. To say you'd been forgetful, that I worried about your memory. I refused, but she's found someone else." The breath left my lungs. They were building a case to declare me mentally unfit. It wasn't just betrayal now, it was an erasure of my autonomy. That was the moment something deep inside me clicked into place. Not rage, not grief, strategy. They wanted to play this through the courts. Then I'd remind them. I wrote the rule book. Catherine always believed she was the strategist, that I had aged into softness while she evolved into steel. But what she failed to understand was that real strategy doesn't bark orders in boardrooms or hide behind lawyers. It watches. It waits. It listens in silence until the precise moment it strikes. The first real move came quietly. I booked an appointment with a neurologist, one not connected to our family network. No names I'd introduced to Catherine, no favors owed, just a clean slate. I walked into that clinic, requested a full cognitive evaluation, and sat through hours of exams, scans, and memory assessments. At the end, the doctor looked at me with a quiet smile. "Your results are remarkable for your age, Mrs. Miles. In fact, your recall and processing speed outperform patients in their 40s. "Put that in writing," I said, "every word, and notarize it." The report went into a manila folder labeled Defense. That would be the first of many. Next, I contacted an old friend, Harriet Lawson, a private investigator who once helped me dismantle a corporate espionage ring. Harriet had since gone freelance with a reputation for being thorough, discreet, and relentless. "Who am I digging into?" she asked. No small talk. "Joshua Reed, my daughter's husband. I want everything. Financials, past cases, offshore accounts, discreetly." There was a beat of silence. "Are you sure?" "He's trying to take away my name, my company, and my mind," I said flatly. "I'm very sure." "Then I'll be very thorough." The phone clicked off, and I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. I didn't need to yell, threaten, or scream for help. I just needed to do what I had always done. Prepare. Back at the guest house, I began compiling a timeline. Every small interaction that now made sense in retrospect. The nights Catherine asked strange questions about my prescriptions. The time Joshua offered to help with my estate planning after dinner. The moment a former employee mentioned being asked about my emotional stability. Each puzzle piece slid into place with terrifying precision. They hadn't just planned to sideline me. They were trying to declare me incompetent. Have me committed, take legal guardianship of my estate, then quietly move me into some luxury facility where I would live out my days under surveillance. They had written my ending, but I had a red pen. and I was about to revise every line. 2 days later, Harriet delivered her first report. It arrived in a black envelope with no return address, our old system from the days when we couldn't afford digital footprints. Inside were printouts, photographs, and 2 USB drives. I locked the door, drew the blinds, and sat with the quiet anticipation of a general reviewing reconnaissance before battle. Joshua Reed was dirty. Not obviously, not sloppily, but methodically. 3 years ago, he had quietly funneled payments into a limited liability shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The deposits came from consulting clients that didn't exist, entities only traceable to obscure holding firms with P.O. boxes instead of offices. And worse, several withdrawals corresponded with milestone events in my company, product launches, legal victories, contract acquisitions. Harriet's notes were precise. This isn't embezzlement. It's trade for influence. He's selling information to competitors. I stared at the screen, lips tightening. Joshua wasn't just trying to remove me. He was profiting off my life's work while preparing to label me incompetent. And Catherine? She had to know. She wasn't naive. If anything, she was always too sharp. The kind of woman who dissected financial reports for fun. The more I stared at the files, the clearer it became. This wasn't Joshua's scheme alone. It was theirs. I placed a flash drive into my secure laptop and began copying the data to an encrypted folder. Then I opened a hidden server I'd kept since my days in the field. Cold storage, untraceable, buried beneath layers of obsolete DNS registries. There, I created a new file. Operation Remember Me. It would be my war chest. Not for retaliation, for control. I uploaded Joshua's files, Catherine's altered trust documentation, and the audio of her dinner conversation with him, captured via a directional mic I had installed in the dining chandelier last year. At the time, I hadn't known why I did it. Call it instinct. Now it was salvation. My final step that day was a letter, handwritten, sealed, stored in my safety deposit box, to be opened only if I am declared mentally unfit. Inside, I listed the names of lawyers, judges, and former clients who still owed me favors. I outlined the history of betrayal, and I included access credentials to the secure server, so the truth wouldn't die with my name. When I sealed that envelope, I didn't feel fear. I felt fire. Catherine and Joshua thought they were building a future. They didn't realize they had awakened the past. I didn't strike right away. Power is a currency best spent with precision. The more predictable your response, the easier it is to manipulate. So I smiled more, attended family dinners, played Scrabble with Lily. I even complimented Catherine's new boardroom redesign, watching her blink in surprise like she couldn't decide whether I was senile or serene. Meanwhile, my war quietly escalated. Harriet uncovered an interesting trail. A psychologist based out of Santa Rosa, Dr. Glenn Harold. He had recently signed a series of evaluation letters recommending court-supervised guardianship for elders with signs of cognitive decline. Most were contested cases. All were dismissed in favor of the petitioner. In every case, the winning party had a financial stake. Guess who was now on Catherine's retainer? Harriet tracked down one of the dismissed defendants, a former school principal named Mrs. Ramirez. Her son had tried to declare her unfit so he could sell her estate. Dr. Harold had testified. The court ruled against her. She lost everything. I visited Mrs. Ramirez myself, unannounced. I brought tea, a recording device, and a copy of the ruling. She lived in a tiny rental apartment now, her former home already demolished. But her mind was sharp enough to recall the inconsistencies in her evaluation. Dr. Harold never asked about my medical history, she told me, voice shaking. He barely looked at me, just wrote his notes while my son listed complaints. I was grieving. I just lost my husband. And they said you were unstable? They said I was unfit, dangerous even, a fall risk, delusional. Her hands trembled as she poured sugar into her cup. I recorded her testimony with her permission. That night, I added it to my archive, alongside a timeline of Dr. Harold's cases. He wasn't just unethical. He was a hired pen. I had enough to ruin him. But I didn't want him ruined. I wanted him warned. So I mailed him a single photograph, an image of him leaving Catherine's office, time-stamped, annotated with court transcripts from Mrs. Ramirez's case, and a note that read, "I know what you're doing. Your next testimony better be the truth, or you won't have a license to sign it with. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to." The next day, Catherine called me unexpectedly. "Mom, I've been thinking," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Maybe we jumped the gun on involving a medical evaluation. You seem sharper lately." I smiled. "Oh, sweetheart," I said sweetly. "I've always been sharp. You just stopped looking." I ended the call with Catherine and stared at the phone a moment longer than necessary. Her shift in tone was sudden and exactly what I wanted, a hesitant retreat. That wasn't guilt, it was fear. Somewhere behind the curtain of her curated life, she had realized I wasn't going to slip away quietly, and more importantly, she wasn't sure how much I knew. That uncertainty was my leverage. I spent the next few days reinforcing the illusion of submission. I brought cookies to Lily's classroom and offered to help Joshua draft a policy document for the board. I played the doting, fading matriarch. All smiles, no suspicion. Every time I entered a room, conversations abruptly changed, like people were learning not to say too much around me. I let them. But in the background, I began phase 2, isolation. I didn't need to destroy Catherine's reputation publicly. I only needed to unravel the mythology she had built about herself. Harriet sent me a photo album, images pulled from her surveillance around town. Catherine wasn't just managing the company. She was actively leveraging my former partners for side investments, promising future positions once the transition was finalized. One photo caught my eye. Catherine at dinner with one of our oldest partners, Roger Kessler. She was smiling wide, champagne in hand. Roger had once held my hand at my husband's funeral. I called him the next morning. "Roger," I said warmly, "I heard you had dinner with my daughter." Long pause. "Ah, yes. Catherine. Bright girl. Did she mention me?" Another pause. "She said you were stepping back, focusing on your health." "I see," I replied. "Just so you know, Roger, my health's never been sharper, and neither is my memory, especially about how your last contract came through my desk at Homeland Security clearance level." He was quiet. "I always did like you, Eleanor," he said finally. "And I remember exactly why," I said gently. "Let's not forget that." The next day, Catherine's meeting with Roger was canceled. The investor she had been pitching walked away without explanation. One crack at a time. That was the strategy. They had used polite deception to rewrite me out of my own legacy. Now I was going to erase their version of the story before they even realized it had changed. The first public crack came not from me, but from a whisper. Whispers are dangerous. They move faster than facts and plant deeper roots. That's why I didn't need to leak documents or call a press conference. All I had to do was send a single anonymous tip to a former cybersecurity journalist I once protected from a libel lawsuit. The subject line read, "Check Joshua Reed's consulting clients. Start with Apex Corps." I attached no files, no accusations, just enough breadcrumbs for someone hungry for a story. By the end of the week, a quiet article appeared online, whispers of compromised data flow in top security firm. It didn't name Joshua or Miles Cyber Defense directly, but the insiders knew. Within hours, 2 of our government clients postponed contract renewals. A third requested an immediate third-party audit. Catherine didn't panic, not at first. She convened a crisis meeting with her senior team. I watched from the doorway, unnoticed, as she paced in front of the projector screen. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, tugging at her sleeves, twisting her wedding ring. Joshua sat silently in the back, checking his phone every 2 minutes. That's how I knew it had landed. He was waiting for blowback. I left the meeting before it ended. I had seen all I needed. At home, I updated my operation board, now filled with lines and arrows mapping out relationships, incentives, and potential breaks in loyalty. You see, people don't flip because they're afraid. They flip because they're unsure who's winning. And that was my next move. Make it look like I was. Harriet delivered the final puzzle piece, a direct tie between Apex Corps and a foreign subcontractor under federal scrutiny. The moment I had that, I called in a favor from a contact at the DOJ. Off the record, I told him, just flag this company. Quietly. Let them feel the heat. He chuckled. You always were good at slow burns. I learned from the best, I replied. By the next morning, a compliance hold was placed on 3 transactions connected to Joshua's firm. Not frozen, just delayed. But to investors, perception was reality. Joshua spent the day in closed-door meetings. Catherine skipped her usual lunch with the COO. And I spent the afternoon in my garden, pruning roses. Victory doesn't always come with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives in silence, while your enemies are too busy explaining themselves to notice the ground shifting beneath them. 3 days later, I received an invitation I hadn't expected. It was from Catherine. A private dinner at her home. No formal agenda, just a chance to reconnect. The handwriting was hers, but it felt rehearsed, as if she had dictated the emotion instead of feeling it. Still, I accepted. There's nothing more dangerous than a wounded opponent trying to make peace on their terms. I arrived 5 minutes early. The house was pristine, of course. A curated performance of warmth, jazz humming from the speakers, rosemary roasting in the air. Catherine greeted me with the same careful smile I used to wear during Senate hearings. "Mom," she said, kissing my cheek, "you look radiant." I laughed gently. "You always were a better liar than a listener." She stiffened, but didn't flinch. Dinner was plated, and Joshua didn't join. Just the 2 of us across a table set for civility. For the first few minutes, we danced around each other. "How's Lily? How's work? Are you sleeping well?" Then Catherine leaned in, wine glass in hand, and dropped her voice. "I'm worried about you, Mom." There it was. I've heard rumors. People saying things. And with all this media noise around Joshua's firm, I just wanted to make sure you're not letting your imagination run away. I set my fork down and smiled. "Catherine," I said softly, "when I imagine things, they don't come with court subpoenas." Her eyes narrowed, but only for a moment. "You've always been strong," she said, "but strength can look like stubbornness when it's not tempered. And ambition can look like betrayal when it's not earned." Silence, the kind that curdles the air. She sighed and pushed back her chair slightly, as if switching tactics. "I'm not your enemy, Mom." "No. You're just someone who stood by while the man you married tried to erase me." Her mouth opened, but no words followed. I let the silence settle. "Tell Joshua," I continued, "that his accounts are being monitored, quietly, that the federal inquiries will grow louder, and that the next person who tries to challenge my sanity better be prepared to prove their own." Catherine's hands trembled around the glass. "You don't know everything," she said bitterly. "I know enough," I replied. Then I stood, kissed her forehead like she was still 10 and afraid of thunderstorms, and walked out. In that moment, I didn't need revenge. I had reclaimed something more powerful, fear, and now it was hers to carry. The next sign of collapse wasn't loud. It was a name, removed quietly from a website. Joshua Reed, formerly listed as Managing Strategic Advisor for Apex Corps, vanished from their executive page without fanfare, no press release, no explanation, just a deletion, as if he'd never existed. But deletions leave shadows. Within hours, Reddit forums that tracked cybersecurity firms began speculating. A thread titled, "Where's Reed?" gained traction. Someone posted a screen grab of the old web page, time-stamped from 2 weeks ago. Others began listing his last public appearances, comparing travel records and asking why no one had seen him since the audit inquiries began. Joshua's digital footprint began shrinking, and I hadn't moved a single piece. That evening, Harriet called. "He's circling the wagons," she said. "Pulled his private funds into a trust with a Panama-based trustee. Looks like he's prepping for flight." I stared out my kitchen window, watching the breeze sway the branches of my lemon tree. "What about Catherine?" She's not pulling money, but she's trying to contact someone from your inner circle, a board member, Edward Monroe. Edward. He and I had weathered 3 administrations together. He once stood up to a cabinet secretary on my behalf. The thought of Catherine approaching him made my stomach tighten. Did he meet with her? I asked. Not yet. He emailed you directly this morning. I checked. Sure enough, there it was. Subject coffee? Body. I think we should talk. Too many hands reaching for the same flame. I responded with one word, tomorrow. When I met Edward at the cafe, he looked older, slightly hunched, like the years had caught up to his loyalty. She says you're unraveling, he said plainly, no preamble. And you? I say you're writing a hell of a comeback. I smiled. Then let me tell you how it ends. And over 2 cappuccinos, I laid out the entire scheme. Joshua's offshore dealings, Catherine's silent complicity, the compromised evaluations, and the plan to seize control of the company by declaring me unfit. I didn't spare details, didn't dramatize, just facts. Cold and surgical. When I finished, Edward exhaled slowly. What do you want from me? Hold the vote. There was one coming. An emergency shareholder meeting Catherine had fast-tracked. The agenda was clear. Restructure leadership under the guise of stability. If you delay it 2 weeks, I'll dismantle their house of cards. Edward nodded once. For you, Eleanor, he said, always 2 weeks. That's all I needed. Time. And the storm that was already on its way. The delay bought me exactly 14 days. 14 days to dismantle the scaffolding of lies Catherine and Joshua had spent months constructing. 14 days to set a match to their carefully curated empire and walk away before the flames reached me. Harriet and I didn't waste a second. We fed breadcrumbs to the right people, not journalists, but regulators, not headlines, but audits. We made sure every inquiry looked organic, every subpoena appeared inevitable, and we did it all without exposing our hand. On day 4, Catherine was served notice of a formal investigation into potential fiduciary misconduct. The news broke on a Friday evening, buried in the media cycle, but enough to unsettle investors who had placed blind faith in her leadership. On day 6, Joshua's travel logs were leaked to an independent watchdog group. One image, him leaving a known shell bank in Nassau, was enough to spark whispers of money laundering. He denied everything. But silence, in our world, always speaks louder. By day 9, the Miles Cyber Defense boardroom resembled a bunker. People stopped making eye contact with Catherine in the halls. Memos circulated reminding staff of confidentiality clauses. The tone shifted, not from confidence to fear, but from fear to doubt. And doubt is where loyalty dies. That's when Catherine tried to call me. Twice. I didn't answer. She sent an email. Let's meet, just you and me, please. I read it 3 times before deleting it, not out of cruelty, but clarity. She didn't want reconciliation. She wanted a ceasefire she hadn't earned. Day 12 brought the final crack. One of our legacy partners, a military tech firm we'd worked with for over a decade, pulled out of a multi-million-dollar renewal. Their reason? Pending leadership clarity. That language was mine. I had written it into our early contracts as a subtle clause to protect the company from exactly this kind of internal sabotage. Irony, I thought, has impeccable timing. On day 13, I stood before my mirror, adjusting the pin on my blazer. A simple silver feather, my husband's favorite symbol. It reminded him of flight, of freedom. Tomorrow, the emergency shareholder meeting would begin. But tonight I would sleep soundly, because the next chapter didn't belong to Catherine or Joshua anymore. It belonged to me. The meeting was held in the same boardroom where I once signed the company's founding charter. Back then, it had been a space of vision, of late nights fueled by ideas, not betrayal. Now, it was a battlefield. I entered 10 minutes early, calm and prepared. Catherine was already seated, flanked by Joshua and 2 other executives whose loyalty had always leaned toward whatever power kept their paychecks coming. She wore navy, regal, reserved. A queen not yet willing to acknowledge the rebellion gathering at her gates. She looked up as I entered. "Mother?" she said quietly. I nodded but said nothing. I wanted her to feel the weight of my silence. The shareholders began to file in, Edward among them. He gave me a brief nod, then took his seat. I could see the questions in their eyes. Not about Catherine or me, about the future, about stability. Joshua stood to open. "There have been recent disruptions," he began, smoothing his tie. "Baseless rumors and politically motivated investigations. But the core of our company remains strong. Today, we move forward with clarity and strength." He clicked a remote. A chart appeared, projections, performance graphs, an illusion of order. Then it was Catherine's turn. She stood and began her rehearsed defense. "My mother has served this company with grace, but the time for transition has come. We need leadership that reflects where we're going, not just where we've been." It was polished, polite, poison. Then the room fell quiet. All eyes turned to me. I rose slowly. "My daughter is right," I began. "The time for transition has come, but not the one she's imagined." I clicked my own remote. A second chart appeared, one Harriet and I had constructed from verified internal documents. It showed fund misappropriation, inconsistencies in expense reports, and transactions linked to shell entities. A hush fell over the room. "These are not accusations," I said. "They are facts, and I have shared them with the appropriate agencies." Joshua went pale. Catherine's jaw tightened. I kept going. "Let's be clear. This is not about personal vengeance. This is about stewardship, about the integrity of a legacy I built not with ambition, but with sacrifice." Edward cleared his throat. "I move to suspend the current vote," he said, "pending a full internal review." Another board member seconded, and just like that, the power shifted. Catherine turned to me, her expression cracking for the first time. "You planned this," she whispered. "No," I said softly. "You did. I just waited for your plan to finish building the gallows." The motion passed in under 2 minutes. By the end of the hour, a temporary oversight committee was formed. Catherine and Joshua were asked to step down, pending investigation. The legal phrasing was polite. The implications were not. Joshua stood as if in a daze, his hands twitching at his sides. I watched him scan the room, looking for allies for rescue. He found none. Catherine, to her credit, did not cry. She sat motionless for several minutes, lips tight, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. But when she finally stood, she looked at me. Not with hatred, but with something far colder. Resentment. "You think this makes us even?" she asked under her breath. "No," I replied. "This makes us honest." She left the room first. Joshua followed without a word. I remained seated as the others filtered out, processing what had just unfolded. Edward lingered, his hand on the back of his chair. "Are you going to press criminal charges?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. "No," I said, "not yet." He raised an eyebrow. "You're sparing them?" "I'm giving them the same courtesy they denied me. Time. Time to think. Time to feel the consequences settle into the marrow of their lives. The world will deliver its judgment. Eventually. I don't have to rush it." He nodded slowly. "Poetic." "Poetry," I said, rising from my chair, "is just justice in a prettier dress." That evening, I returned to my house and poured a glass of wine I'd been saving for years. Not for celebration, but for closure. I stood by the window and watched the clouds shift above the trees. Catherine wasn't finished. I knew that. Her pride wouldn't let her fade quietly. But the truth was, she didn't have to disappear for me to win. She only had to lose her illusion of power. That night, I received a message from Harriet. "He's trying to flee. Cayman Islands transfer triggered an alert." I typed one word back. "Let him." Joshua would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, never sure which shadow held the consequence he thought he'd escaped. And Catherine? She would be left to reckon with her own reflection, realizing, perhaps too late, that legacy isn't something you seize, it's something you earn. 3 days later, the media caught up. It began as a whisper in the financial news, the kind of quiet headline that corporations pretend not to see. Leadership shakeup at Miles Cyber Defense raises questions of internal fraud. But the whispers became echoes. Echoes became thunder. By the end of the week, the story had spilled into mainstream outlets. Catherine's photo, once used in puff pieces about powerful women in tech, now appeared beside phrases like ethics review and executive mismanagement. Joshua's name trended for 48 hours straight after someone posted a grainy video of him boarding a private jet in Bermuda, eyes wide and wild. I watched none of it. Instead, I worked, quietly, purposefully, restoring the pieces they had tried to unravel, rebuilding what had once been mine. The Oversight Committee had appointed me interim chair. Harriet was promoted to lead internal audit, and Edward had taken it upon himself to draft new compliance protocols, ones rooted in transparency, not influence. The office no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a home being cleaned after a long, bitter storm. But amid the rising hope, there were shadows. Catherine wasn't silent. She gave a carefully orchestrated interview to a well-known business podcast, claimed she was the target of a smear campaign led by a disgruntled former executive. She never named me directly. She didn't have to. Her voice carried that same old blend of charm and control, meant to persuade those who didn't know the full story. But charm can't erase a paper trail, and control means nothing when the strings are already severed. I didn't respond. Neither did the company. Let her speak. The louder she got, the more desperate she sounded. And desperation, like power, has a scent. Behind closed doors, the DOJ's inquiry had expanded. I wasn't involved, officially, but Harriet kept me informed. 2 junior executives had turned, flipped, as they say, provided documents, testimony. The case was growing teeth, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a breath of peace. I wasn't vindicated yet, but I was close. Close enough to stop looking over my shoulder, close enough to start dreaming again. The reckoning, when it came, wasn't loud. It was clinical. On a Thursday morning, while sunlight broke through the office blinds, a single press release hit the wire. Miles Cyber Defense confirms federal charges filed against former executives. No spin, no defense, just fact. Joshua was indicted on 5 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering. Catherine wasn't named in the charges yet, but her proximity to the financial missteps drew attention from federal investigators. She'd soon be caught in the ripples. I sat at my desk rereading the press release, not with glee, but with gravity. This wasn't vengeance. It was justice, by attrition. The phone rang, Harriet. "They're preparing a grand jury hearing," she said. "They want to speak to you again, off the record." "Of course," I replied. "Tell them I'll be there Monday." I hung up and looked out the window. For the first time in years, I could feel the weight lifting. The kind of weight that doesn't just settle in your bones. It hides in your laughter, your sleep, your breath. And then one day, without warning, it begins to dissolve. That night, I visited Thomas's grave. I hadn't been in months. I brought a single gardenia and a bottle of the same wine we used to drink on our anniversary. I sat down, poured 2 glasses, out of habit, out of love, and placed one beside his headstone. "You were right," I said softly. "About Catherine. About trusting my gut. About never letting ambition become identity." The wind stirred through the trees. "I didn't want to fight her," I continued, "but I had to, because if I hadn't, everything we built would have belonged to people who never earned it." I took a sip of the wine, let the silence stretch between us. "You once told me that legacy wasn't the stories we tell, it's the proof we leave behind." I smiled. "Well, here's the proof, my love." Behind me, the city lights flickered like a constellation of second chances. I raised my glass to the stone beside me. "To endings," I whispered, "and to beginnings." And then I drank to both. The office felt different now, not quieter, though the absence of whispered meetings and closed-door schemes had silenced the undercurrent of tension. It wasn't lighter either. What I felt was something more profound, more rare. It was peace, the kind earned through fire. Harriet had settled into her new role like she'd been born for it. Every report came back polished, every audit ahead of schedule. She smiled more now. Not out of relief, but out of respect for what she'd helped save. Edward was still at my side. His once weary gait seemed steadier these days. We met twice a week to review operations, and our meetings ran short, filled with agreement instead of politics. And the staff, those who remained, looked me in the eye when we passed in the hall. Some nodded, others smiled. None of them whispered anymore. It had taken months, but Miles' cyber defense was no longer a battleground. It was a company again, a mission again, a dream reborn, not rebuilt. One morning, I arrived early, before dawn. The halls were dark, the world still asleep. I stood in the atrium and looked up at the ceiling mural Thomas had commissioned years ago. It showed a constellation, one we'd both loved. Cassiopeia, the queen chained to her fate. A reminder, he said, that even legends bear scars, but Cassiopeia still shines. I moved toward the conference room, where Harriet had left a fresh file on the table. New clients, high-level contracts, the kind that reminded me our story wasn't ending, it was beginning again. But something else sat beside it. A note. Folded, simple, handwritten. I opened it and recognized the looping cursive. Catherine, Mother, I won't ask for forgiveness, not because I don't want it, but because I don't deserve it. You were always stronger than I allowed myself to admit. I wanted to be more than your daughter, but instead of carving my own path, I tried to erase yours. I failed, but I'm trying to learn. And someday, I hope to be someone you'd respect again. C. I read it twice, then folded it, placed it back on the table, and walked to my office. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. Catherine had finally said the truth. Not publicly, not with cameras watching, but in the only way that mattered. And that was enough. Sometimes the loudest victories are the quiet ones. The ones that settle inside you like a final page. The days that followed were marked not by triumph, but by rhythm. I fell into a routine. Morning walks before sunrise, black coffee in the courtyard, meetings that ended on time. It was strange how life could rebuild itself in quiet increments, like muscle regaining strength after an old wound. There was no parade, no confetti or applause, just the quiet dignity of continuation. I started mentoring again. 3 young women from the leadership development program, smart, curious, and most importantly, still unafraid to fail. One of them asked me during our first session what I thought the hardest part of leadership was. Letting go of the illusion that control equals safety, I said. They nodded, but I saw it in their eyes. They didn't quite understand. Not yet, they would. One morning, I walked past the old wing, the executive suites Catherine and Joshua once used. The doors were locked now, stripped of nameplates. I stood there for a moment, remembering how it felt to be exiled from my own creation, how cold it was, how sharp. And then I smiled. That part of me was gone now. Back in my office, I updated the company mission statement. Just a few words revised, but they mattered. We protect not only systems, but the people behind them. Thomas would have liked that. Later that week, I received an unexpected package. No return address, but the handwriting on the label was unmistakably familiar. I opened the box carefully. Inside was a simple black leather journal, unused, a ribbon bookmark and a small note tucked inside the cover. Every empire needs a new story. This time, write it your way. C. No apology, no request, just the recognition. That night, I opened the journal. The first page remained blank, not because I didn't know what to write, but because for the first time in years, I realized I didn't need to write the past anymore. The past had already spoken. Now, it was time to imagine something new. 2 months passed before I saw Catherine again. It happened by accident, if such things are ever accidental. I was exiting a small bookstore downtown, one of those cozy places that smelled of cedar and paper. A voice behind me said quietly, "Mother, I turned. She stood across the sidewalk, clutching a reusable tote bag filled with what looked like legal textbooks and parenting guides. Her hair was pulled back, no makeup, no designer heels. She looked tired, human. We stood there for a moment, the noise of the city moving around us like we were frozen in another frame. "I wasn't following you," she said. "I just come here sometimes, for the quiet." I nodded. "Me too." She hesitated. "Do you have time?" I looked at the sky, overcast but calm. "Yes." We walked to a nearby bench. For 10 minutes, neither of us spoke. It was like sitting next to the ghost of an old life, unsure if touching it would make it disappear or turn it real. Finally, she spoke. "I've been seeing a counselor." I didn't react. "I know it doesn't fix anything," she added, "but I needed someone to look at the wreckage with me, to help me name what I destroyed." That I hadn't expected. She looked up, searching my face. "I was angry at you, for being strong, for building something I thought I had to claim to be worth anything." "You never had to claim it," I said gently. "You only had to grow beside it." She swallowed hard. "I'm learning, slowly." I looked at her, not as the woman who betrayed me or the executive who tried to dismantle my life. I looked at her as a daughter who had finally stopped running. "It's a long road," I said. "I know. And it doesn't end in forgiveness," I continued. "Not if that's all you're walking for." She nodded. "I'm not walking toward that," she said. "I'm walking toward understanding." For the first time in years, I believed her. We sat for a while longer, letting the past drift between us like smoke. When she stood to leave, she hesitated. "Happy early birthday," she said. "I remember you always loved books more than flowers." Then she walked away. And I remained on that bench, her words echoing in my chest. She remembered. Not everything was broken. Some things were simply waiting to be rebuilt. Spring arrived late that year. But when it came, it arrived in full bloom. Golden mornings, soft breezes, and the kind of warmth that settles into your skin like a long-forgotten promise. I spent more time outside, planted herbs on the windowsill, took walks through the city park where Thomas and I once watched ducks skim across the lake. The quiet had stopped feeling empty. It felt earned. At work, the company had stabilized. Growth projections were up. The team was steady. There were still moments of tension. Yes, this was business after all. But the poison was gone. And in its place, something like trust had begun to take root. One afternoon, Edward brought me a letter. "From the board," he said. "They want to make your appointment permanent, full executive chair." I raised an eyebrow. "Again?" He chuckled. "Different this time. No conditions, just recognition." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out the window at the courtyard where a pair of interns laughed over coffee. "I'll think about it," I said finally. Edward nodded, understanding without pressing. That evening, I returned home to find a small package on my doorstep. No name. Inside was a framed photograph, grainy, black and white. It showed Catherine at about 8 years old, sitting on my lap as we watched Thomas read a book aloud. She had drawn a crooked crown on her own head with blue crayon. Beneath it, a note. "I found this in an old shoebox. I thought maybe you'd kept it. If not, you should. See." I traced the outline of her tiny hand resting over mine in the photo, and something cracked open inside me. Not pain, not regret, something softer, memory. I placed the frame on the shelf beside the journal she had given me, and for the first time I believed the past could coexist with the future, not as an anchor, but as a root. Later that night, as the sky turned lavender above the city skyline, I sat at my desk, opened the journal, and wrote just 5 words on the first page. "Today, everything feels possible again." I never thought much about legacy, not in the traditional sense. When I was younger, legacy meant buildings with names etched in stone, foundations started in someone's honor, or children raised to carry the weight of a surname like a banner. But now, sitting in the twilight of my 60s, I understand it differently. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you protect along the way. Miles Cyber Defense held its 10-year anniversary that summer. The board insisted on hosting a gala, champagne, media, even a keynote speaker from Washington. They wanted me to deliver the closing remarks. I resisted at first. I didn't care for the spotlight anymore. But Edward reminded me that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't told in courts or contracts. They're told from a stage, to those still deciding who they want to become. That night, as I stood behind the podium, the lights dimmed and the room waited. I spoke, not of numbers or milestones, but of choice, of how betrayal doesn't break you, unless you let it rewrite who you are. Of how the greatest strength in leadership isn't dominance, but endurance, and of how protecting something, whether it's a company, a family, or your own principles, requires sacrifice, yes, but also forgiveness. I didn't mention names. I didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew the history, the whispers, the headlines, but they also knew the outcome. And sometimes, survival is its own legacy. Afterward, as the crowd mingled and the music swelled, a young woman approached me. She looked barely 25, clutching a notepad filled with scribbles. "Your story," she said softly, "it helped me." I smiled. "How so?" "I was about to quit. My job, my path, everything. I thought if I wasn't winning, I was failing. But then you said something that stuck with me, about endurance." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for proving that quiet strength still matters." I nodded, touched in a way words couldn't express. And in that moment, I understood what Thomas had always meant. Legacy isn't your name remembered. It's your courage echoed. The week after the gala, I received a letter in thick parchment paper, gold-trimmed edges, the kind only universities or ceremonial institutions still used. It was from the University of Chicago. They wanted to establish a scholarship fund in my name, full tuition for underprivileged women pursuing degrees in cybersecurity and ethics. A panel of former students, faculty, and alumni had nominated me without my knowledge. I stared at the embossed seal for a long while, letting the weight of it settle. This was the kind of legacy I never imagined, one that lived in people I'd never meet, dreams I'd never witness. But maybe that's the most powerful kind. When I called to thank them, the dean said something that stuck with me. "You inspired others not by perfection, but by persistence. That matters." That evening, I found myself alone in the office again, long after most had gone home. The building hummed softly, the quiet song of servers, routers, and time passing. I took the long route to the archive room, where we kept our oldest files, the company's first contracts, early blueprints, even photographs from our launch day. On the top shelf was a single box labeled Founders, Personal. Inside were 3 frame photographs, one of Thomas standing beside the company's original server rack, one of us together laughing over spilled coffee and a faulty prototype, and one of Catherine as a teenager, shadowing me on Take Your Child to Work Day, eyes wide with ambition. I placed the newest photograph, her recent gift, next to the others. 4 corners of my world, 4 pieces of a complicated legacy. Not all perfect, not all proud, but all real. And that mattered more. I didn't need statues or buildings with my name engraved in brass. I didn't need applause. What I needed, what I finally had, was this quiet understanding. I had endured the storm, not untouched, but unbroken, and now what remained was mine to define. As I turned to leave, I paused by the light switch and looked back one last time. Then I smiled and turned off the lights. Retirement was never part of the plan. People had asked me, subtly at first, then more directly, "Don't you want to travel? Spend time with friends? See the world?" But I had seen the world in all its beauty and betrayal. What I hadn't seen enough of was stillness. I didn't need a plane ticket or cruise line brochure. I needed mornings where I could wake without crisis, without boardroom strategy, without scanning every conversation for coded threats. So I scaled back, 3 days a week at the office, 2 at home, mentoring, writing, gardening. I found joy in small things again. Fresh tomatoes from the balcony planter, rain tapping against the windows during afternoon naps, the silence after finishing a good book. Even the creak of old floorboards felt like a kind of music. One Thursday morning, Harriet stopped by with a cinnamon scone and a worried expression. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. I looked up from my journal and smiled. "Yes," I said. "For the first time in decades, I think I really am." She nodded, still unsure. They didn't understand, not yet, that peace doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it tastes like cinnamon and arrives with no appointment. That afternoon, I began drafting my memoir, not for publication, but for my granddaughter. Yes, Catherine had a daughter now, born quietly without ceremony after the storm had passed. She named her Eliza. And when I first held that child, tiny, soft, unaware of the history that had shaped her bloodline, I felt something release inside me. Not forgiveness, not even healing, just a kind of clarity. The next generation didn't need to inherit our wounds. They only needed our wisdom, and I would give it freely. The pages of the memoir filled slowly. Stories I had never told. Lessons I had paid for dearly. Hopes I dared to speak aloud. When Eliza was old enough to read, she would know the truth. Not the curated version told in business journals or news clippings, but the truth of what it meant to fall and rise again. Because that, above all, was my legacy. On a cool autumn afternoon, I sat on the back porch with Eliza nestled in my lap, her tiny fingers curled around mine like ivy wrapping an old fence. She babbled nonsense, content with the rhythm of my voice as I read aloud from a weathered copy of Charlotte's Web. Her eyes followed the pages, even though she didn't understand a word. But that didn't matter. What mattered was presence. Catherine watched from the doorway. Her face was calm, but I could see the layers behind her eyes. Gratitude, guilt, caution. She had changed. Not completely, but enough. She no longer chased control. She no longer mistook ambition for identity. In the quiet moments, she let herself feel, and more importantly, be felt. "Thank you," she whispered as she stepped out with 2 mugs of tea. I accepted mine wordlessly. Not because I had nothing to say, but because we both understood that some forgiveness comes not through language, but through consistency. We sipped in silence as the leaves turned gold and rust around us. Eliza tugged at my sweater, pointing at a squirrel darting along the fence line. I smiled and followed her gaze. In that second, I understood something I had missed for so many years, that joy doesn't require resolution. It requires attention. Inside the house, the smell of rosemary chicken drifted from the kitchen. A small dinner, just the 3 of us. There would be no press, no speeches, no toasts, just food, laughter, and maybe a bedtime story before Catherine drove Eliza home. After they left, I sat alone with my tea, listening to the creaks of the old house settling for the night. The place no longer felt like a fortress or a hiding place. It felt like a story that had finally reached its final chapter. Not with a bang, but with a gentle exhale. Before heading to bed, I opened the journal, the one Catherine had given me years ago. The pages were nearly full now, covered in ink and memory, but I left the last page blank, not for lack of words, but because every legacy, no matter how complete, must leave room for the next voice, for Eliza, for whatever stories she will one day tell, not just of what I built or survived, but of what I chose to love, even when it was hard. And that, I realized as I turned out the light, was enough.